Good evening and welcome to tonight's shiur, Parshas Seitsei. And we'll go straight to our first question. The question was asked by a shliach who he would like to do his meals in the Chabad house on Succos. Wants to do the first meal, the first night of Succos early. And also Shmini Atzeres, he wants to do the meal early. His motives are that if people will come for a meal earlier, then there's not a worry of, well, at least on the way there, they won't be driving on Yomtov. So that's his interest. So is it okay to do meals, to be Mekabel Yomtov early and to do the meal early? So actually, both of them are a bit problematic. With Succos, we all know there's a concept of Tosfos Shabbos, Tosfos Yomtov. You can start Shabbos early. When you start Shabbos early, all right, it becomes that you are not allowed to do Melacha. But if you start Pesach early, it means that Isur Melacha starts early, but not that it's actually Pesach. You can't have your Seder early. You can't have your Kazayas Matzah early. You can't have your first cup of wine for Kaddish, which is one of the Arba Kosas early. So that's the big challenge when it comes to the Seder night. But there's similarly the first night of Succos. There's a mitzvah of eating a kazayas in the sukkah, where we have a Gzeira Shova, Chamisha Osor, the 15th of Nisan and the 15th of Tishri are compared to one another. And so you, just like you cannot have the kazayas matzah earlier, before night. So the same thing with Succos. You wouldn't be able to have your first kazayas and to be Mekayim the mitzvah and say Aksheket Shon mitzvah v'tzivon Lechem Mishneh. That would have to wait until nightfall. So the first night of Succos, you can daven Ma'ariv a little bit earlier, but the meal would have to start at nightfall. The comes to Shmini Atzeres is not such a problem, but if you'd start the meal on Shmini Atzeres, let's say before sunset, half an hour before sunset, so it's still Succos. So here you'll have a dilemma. If you're going to start making Kaddish for Shmini Atzeres, but you're sitting in the sukkah because it's still technically Succos. So really you should be making a brocho Lechem Mishneh. But you can't really say Lechem Mishneh just when you just said it's B'yom Shmini Atzeres HaChag. So this is why you wouldn't be able to start the meal on Shmini Atzeres before sunset. Whereas I think it would be okay to start after Shkia. Although here you have a Taz in Siman Tov Reish Samach Ches. It's a very large piece in the Taz. It covers most of the page. And he's quoting here from the Rashal of Shlomo Luria in the name of Reb Tevel, who would not have the Shmini Atzeres meal until Laila, because otherwise you'd have a problem of Lechem Mishneh. What I'd like to say is that once it's Ben Hashmoshes, once it's after Shkia, you can't say the brocho of Lechem Mishneh in any case, because it's Sofek Laila. So on that basis, I felt it's okay to start the meal as long as it's after Shkia. So then the whole problem is, are you going to make a brocho Lechem Mishneh? But if it's already after Shkia, that should be okay. Right, so that's the first question of having the meals early on Shmini Atzeres, the first night of Succos. First night of Succos have to be after nightfall. First night of the night of Shmini Atzeres, so should be at least after Shkia. Next question. So let's scroll down. Someone asks me, he has an Esrog with a pitem, with no pitem. Actually, the one who's asked me this question, I guess he is a retailer of Esroigim in Yerushalayim. And he asks me, what's the story about the hole in the Esrog? Where if you have a pitem, so there's a growth which goes out of the Esrog, a little nipple of some sort. When there's, for the way the esrog grows, there's no pitem, so there's a slight recess. But sometimes that recess is a bit more than just a little bit. It's actually like a hole. And we know that there is one of the psulim of Esrog, one of the things which we disqualify of Esrog, as discussed in Siman Tov Reish Mem Tes. I think there's Mem Ches. Whatever, it is in that area. It talks about what would disqualify an Esrog if an Esrog had a hole. All right, there's different levels, and the halacha is if the hole is through and through. What does it mean through and through? Either all the way through the esrog, or the esrog has got what's called chadrei hazera. It's got the chambers of the seeds. So if the hole would go all the way through to where the seeds are, that would disqualify the esrog. True. So what I told this fellow, I told him, well, we're going to have to check whether this hole in the tip of the esrog, does it go down to chadrei hazera? My experience is that they don't, but it's just well to check it out. This is from a sefer which talks about this very question. It's called Kashrus Arba'as Haminim by Rabbi Yechiel Mechelstern. He mentions that this is common in the Teimani Esroigim. Well, we know the same is with the is quoting here from the Bikur Yaakov, from Rabbi Yaakov Ettinger. Sometimes there is a recess, and if it goes all the way to Chadrei Hazera, to where the seeds are, that would be a problem. If it doesn't reach that far, then that's okay. And he says you can check it by putting in a needle. Don't push the needle. You see how far the needle goes, and then you'd be able to see whether it had reached far enough, far enough to be a problem. I remember seeing one of the senior Dayanim here take a hair from his beard, and instead of using a needle, he put a hair from his beard and stuck it into the hole and saw how far it goes. So this, the one who asked me the question, well, he's a retailer, he has quite a few Esroigim. He took these photographs for me, and he measured this. He called it a Chinese needle for whatever reason. You can see there's the needle, and it's got like a little handle. So the actual needle is 1 centimeter. And he put the needle down in that hole at the tip of the esrog, and it went, you can see it's about a half a centimeter that it went penetrated. That's as far as it goes. He then cut open one of the Esroigim, and there you can see that half a centimeter goes till, it's way, way away from the Chadrei Hazera. It's about 2.5 centimeters from the tip to Chadrei. This is very typical. And as a result, I don't see it as any problem. It's a natural hole. It's not a damage. It's a natural hole, and it's not penetrating. And I don't think it's a problem at all. Then he asks, is it Mehuder? I can't say, is it Mehuder? If people ask a question, then why do you have to have a question? But I told him as a vendor, I don't think he has to point it out to people. If people are buying this, and I don't see any compromising kashrus in this esrog at all. Let's move on. Okay, so here we come to a very interesting discussion, and this is about the interruption in davening for responding to Kaddish. Some 20-something years ago, the late Rabbi Yitzchok Edelman put together a booklet about the interruptions in davening, what you're allowed to interrupt for, etc. And he created a graph. He created a table, and it became very popular, and to the point that America's Kahos, first in Israel and then in America, they included that table in the back of the Sidurim. So if you're in the middle of davening and there's something else going on, you're not with the minyan, so you could flip to the back of the Siddur and see whether you should or you shouldn't interrupt. Okay, this was Rabbi Yitzchok Edelman Olav Shalom. Some years later, it's also more than 20, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, whatever, someone by the name of Rabbi Yovel Lemberg, who lives in, I think, in Kfar Chabad, at any rate, it's a eminent Talmud Chacham, and he, a young man, and he started delving into this whole topic of hefsek b'tefillah, of interrupt. What are you allowed to interrupt for in davening? And he subsequently put out a sefer called Hefsek b'tefillah, and it's been published. It's been reprinted with an expanded edition. So it's obviously a successful sefer. The fact that sefer has got a second print usually means it's been well received. At any rate, the two authors are at loggerheads about several points, but one I was asked to be the referee upon. And so here we go. It's about, as I said, it's about if you are in Pesukei deZimra, after Baruch She'omar until Yishtabach, not inclusive of either of those, just during the Pesukei deZimra, and you hear Kaddish. So do you respond to all the Omeins of Kaddish? Do you respond to all the Omeins of Kaddish until Da'amiram bi'olma ve'imru Omein? Or do you only respond to two Omeins of the Kaddish, Omein Yehesh Be'rabo and Omein of Da'amiram bi'olma? So the way Rabbi Edelman put it is that you answer all Omeins until Da'amiram bi'olma, but not the ones afterwards of Yehesh Shlomo or Tiskabel or Al Yisrael Rabbanon. Those that part you don't respond to. But the first five Omeins of the Kaddish, he took the position you do respond. Whereas Rabbi Lemberg, Soll sein gesund, he takes the view that only two Omeins you respond to. And so now I'm going to share with you a letter of the Rebbe, and be assured that it's not mefurish in Shulchan Aruch so clearly, and therefore there is the room for reading it both ways. So there's a letter of the Rebbe, and this was written in response to Reb Nochem Lapkovsky Olav Sholem, who some of you may remember, and he had asked about interrupting during Pesukei deZimra, and here the Rebbe quotes the Alter Rebbe's Siddur. So we've got the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and then we have the Alter Rebbe's Siddur, and which has several halachas, and those are also printed at the back of the Shulchan Aruch. And there, the Alter Rebbe is talking about when you're interrupting in Birchas Krishma. For the moment, we're talking about Birchas Krishma. If you're interrupting for Moedim, you only say the first three words. Moedim and Achnulach. If you're mafsik for Kaddish, you only say, I'm going to scroll down, you'll see what the Rebbe is quoting. When you interrupt for Moedim, you'll bow, you'll say Moedim and Achnulach, no more. You mafsik for Kaddish, you'll say Omein Shmerabo, and then you'll say until the Imru Omein, and you answer. But Tiskabel and onwards, you don't answer, because those are just minhag. So again, the rest of Moedim, and the rest of Kaddish, the other Omeins of Kaddish, on the level of minhag. Then the Alter Rebbe goes about Kedusha, and he says, if you are in Birchas Krishma, you only answer Bor Kodesh, the Pasuk Kodesh, Pasuk Baruch, and the Pasuk, and also Yimlech, the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. But the pieces which we add on Shabbos, they are not an indigenous part of the Kedusha, and therefore, in other words, they are on the level of Minhag, and you would not respond, you would not say those parts when you're in Birchas Krishma. Then he says further, because I skipped a bit, then he says, other brochos you don't answer Omein, but in Pesukei deZimra, you do answer Omein even in the middle of a chapter. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the Rebbe's letter, where he's quoted the Alter Rebbe, who mentioned three items: Moedim, Kaddish, and Kedusha. And in Kedusha, he said only the parts, the essential parts, not the extra parts. Says the Rebbe, Mizedi Yakti Shtayim, that first of all, I've inferred from this 2 points. Number one, that the Alter Rebbe sees the end of Moedim after the first three words, and the other parts of Kedusha, they are on the same level. Number two, I've inferred that if you're not allowed to interrupt for them, if you're not allowed to interrupt, you can't say those pieces. V'im kain gam b'Pesukei deZimra din kain. If so, I'm going to assume that in Pesukei deZimra, you can't say the whole of Kaddish. You can't answer the whole of Kedusha. You can't answer the whole of Moedim. And he says, if you read further, the Alter Rebbe says in Pesukei deZimra, you can answer Omein. So he's only conceding on Omein you can answer every Omein. With mashma that this is the only difference between Pesukei deZimra and Birchas Krishma, that you can answer all Omeins, but everything else is the same. Okay. Then let's go to the next piece. The Rebbe says, then I was hesitating. And then he says, what I've seen, I've seen practically, the minig is to answer in Pesukei deZimra, not Birchas Krishma. Yeah, again, our source is in Birchas Krishma, our application is about Pesukei deZimra. And the Rebbe says, what I've seen in Poyal is that people are answering the whole of Moedim in Pesukei deZimra. And they have a riyuk from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. Okay. And I was told that this was the minig of Tomchet Mimim in Poland, to say not only the whole of Moedim, but also the whole of Kedusha. And that's how it's mashma for the Chai Odom and the Derech HaChaim. Okay. So what we've seen here is, at the beginning of the letter, the Rebbe has taken a stricter view and said that the only concession, as far as the only concession with Omein is in relation to Omein of a brocho. He hasn't said anything about Omein of a Kaddish, and he's also being quite rigid about, quite machmir about answering Kedusha and Moedim, only the bare essentials. The end of the letter, he says, what I'm seeing is the other way around, that they say the whole of Moedim and the whole of Kedusha. At this point, he hasn't addressed about the whole of Kaddish. Lemaisa, this is in Tovshin Tes in 1949. Lemaisa, I asked my father-in-law, the Rebbe, and he said that in Pesukei deZimra, you say the whole of Nusach HaKedusha and the whole of Moedim. So if the Rebbe had been at first taking a more strict position and then saying that people are taking the more lenient position, what did the Frierdiker Rebbe say? Kol Nusach HaKedusha, the more lenient position, the whole of Kedusha is said in Pesukei deZimra, and Moedim, the whole of Moedim. So he's in those two, he's taken the lenient position. Now we have this ambiguous last 5 words. Avaloi Omein shemitiskabel v'Yaaleh. The Rebbe says, but not the rest of Kaddish, from Tiskabel onwards. So now, what about the until Tiskabel? So Rabbi Edelman understood, and that's what most of us understood, that until Tiskabel, you do answer all the Omeins in Pesukei deZimra. Rabbi Lemberg Zolzeingesund has taken the view, no, that in Kaddish, you only answer the 2 essential Omeins, or Omein Shverabo and Amiram Be'alma. So these are the 2 views. And I was asked what's my take on it, and I'm telling you, I'm sharing this with you, that I'm seeing here that they're starting off from a stricter position, and then the end of the letter, and certainly the consent of the Frierdiker Rebbe, is to take the more lenient position, the more inclusive, to say the whole of Kedusha, the whole of Moedim, and therefore I'm going to say it means all the Omeins too. Now, it might sound like a bit of guesswork. Okay, so let's go down now and see what, well, we're going to see a bit more support for my position. Okay, so there we go. We have here the Ben Ish Chai. Yeah, I hesitated. I wanted to say, what's going on over here? We have here a more halacha position, which is stricter, and the more lemaisa, which is more lenient. Possibly, lemaisa, we're following more al derech hakabbalah, and therefore derech hakabbalah to say the whole of Kedusha and to say the whole of Moedim, and then we're going to say, well, what does Kabbalah say about the importance of those Omeins? Bear in mind, in the Gemara, there's not a word about this. The reason, the reason why we do interrupt, and every kid who learns a bit of Mishnah says that in Krishma, Birchas Krishma, Mafsikim b'nei Yiro, Mafsikim b'nei Kovoid, whole story. Anyone who's learned Mishnah brocho knows about this. So then the poskim said, if you can interrupt for pnei hakovid and pnei hayira, therefore you can interrupt to answer kedusha and moedim, etc. So it's all based on not very strong. It's comparing to the Gemara. It's not. It depends how important it is, basically. So the question is now: are all the Omeins important, or only those two important? That really is the essence of the question. So now, therefore, I'm going to the Ben Ish Chai, who was, as we know, very knowledgeable in Kabbalah as well as in Halocho. For example, in his Sefer Rav Piolim, he has whole shuvas on explaining Yonim al Pi Kabbalah. As we know, the Sfardim never stopped learning Kabbalah. The Ashkenazim shied away a few hundred years ago, besides Chassidim, but the Ashkenazim, the Sfardim. So the limit of Kabbalah is very standard. At any rate, he writes the following. This is in Ben Ish Chai Pashas Vayigash, and he writes in after Baruch Sha'omar, Hine b'sefer hakotem bekabtziel. I have proven from the words of the Arizal that you should say the whole, or when you answer Omein Shmirabo, to say until Admirim Ba'olma. All right, I'm not going to discuss that now. V'chein yane chamisho amedim rishonim shel Kaddish. So Ben Ish Chai says very clearly to say the first 5 omens of Kaddish. That's Sif Tes. In Sif Yud, he says, in Pesukei deZimra, you answer all the omens. As the Rebbe Chaim Vital says in the name of Arizal, he would answer omen of all brochos, even in the middle of Zmiris and the Pesukei deZimra. But Leipirish Lonu, he didn't explain clearly about the omens after Tiskabel, of Tiskabel, or Al Yisrael, or Al Yehei Shlomo. So for those omens on brochos, you do answer in Pesukei deZimra. But omens on the latter parts of Kaddish, the 3 different types of Kaddish. So then he says, I don't have a clarity from the Arizal. And in my other Sefer HaKotten, Mekabtziel Nistapach Hibozeh, I'm not sure. And then he quotes an earlier Sefer from called Shalmei Tzibur, I think it's Avram Al-Kalai, I'm not sure. Well-known Sefer, where he says, Mashma degree aminim elu min amenim de brochos. That the omens of the latter part of Kaddish are less significant than the omens of brochos. So what we're seeing here, the Ben Ish Chai is saying very clearly that the first 5 omens are all seen very important up here at Kabbalah, and therefore there shouldn't be any compromise on those. The ones afterwards, yes. So then when I go back and see this letter of the Rebbe, and he says, Sha'alti, I asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he says, say the whole of Kedusha, say the whole of Moedim, and not for Omein of Tiskabel ve'elech. Yes, it's exactly the same as what the Ben Ish Chai had said, that after from Tiskabel onwards, not, but everything until then should be said. So I believe we've got very strong basis to take the more lenient view to answer all omens in Kaddish, as was said by the late Rabbi Edelman. We'll go on to the next question. So one of our listeners, asked me a question about Quaker oats and whether you're allowed to make these oats on Shabbos in a Kli Shlishi. So we have Kli Rishon cooks, and you're not allowed to put raw food in a Kli Rishon, we all know that. Kli Sheni is able to cook Kale Habishul, things which will cook easily, and therefore we don't put we won't use a Kli Sheni for many foods. But generally is assumed that Kli Shlishi is not mevashul regardless. And therefore that was the question. Can you make these Quaker oats on Shabbos in a cup, which is a Kli Shlishi? Kli Shlishi means you pour from the kettle into a cup, and from that cup into a second cup. That second cup is called the Kli Shlishi. It's the third cup, the third container since the kettle. So despite the general understanding that Kli Shlishi is not mavashal, but here's something which you clearly see. You see it is changing the status of that food. And so instead of relying on my own assessment, I'm happy always to share with you of contemporary poskim. So this is from Rabbi Farkash, soll sein gesund, in his first volume of Shabbos Halocho, and he writes the following: Dvorim, things which we see bechush, we see tangibly that they are cooking in Kli Shlishi. He gives an example: a raw egg. The next word, if you can't read Ivrit, is kvaker, otherwise known as Quaker, or in Hebrew called Haredi. He says Quaker oats, etc., similar. You're not allowed to put them, even those who in principle do allow a Kli Shlishi. But that's only about foods which are not cooking. But if things which are clearly being cooked, then you wouldn't be allowed to do that even in Kli Shlishi. And he says where Kli Shlishi would be allowed. He says things like salt, tea leaves, where it's just changing the color. Okay, that you can use a Kli Shlishi, but something which is clearly changing the food, and that's what bishul is about: using heat to change the form, the format, the consistency of the food to make it edible. So that's what bishul is about. That's what cooking is about, and you see it is cooking. So no, you cannot use the Quaker oats in Kli Shlishi. He has a similar position about the soup in a cup, which we're familiar. You have these polystyrene cups, and you've got these noodles and whatever, and it says fill with hot water until this point and leave it for 2 minutes. That kind of thing. Also, Rav Forkash says you wouldn't be allowed to use them on Shabbos. All right. I gave the same shiur yesterday, and someone asked me, what about baby cereal? I think that's different. And it's not cooking. It's been cooked already, possibly, but there is the only thing I think. Once it's Kli Shlishi, and by the way, Kli Shlishi is only if it's Yaaleh, but if it's going to be cold or liquid, that's not a problem. Cooking is only with Yaaleh, which is about 120 degrees, whatever. If it's regular hand temperature, that wouldn't be a problem. With the baby cereal, we have a different issue, and that is lisha or losh, which is making a dough and making powder, loose powder particles into a mass. So you've got when you add water or milk, let's say, to a powder, and then it becomes a mass. That comes under the question of losh or lisha, and the way to do it is, in a permitted way, is to make it more let's use less viscous, less thick than on a weekday, and two other shinuyim. The two shinuyim are: one is the way you combine water or liquid and powder, and the other way is shinui is the way you stir. If normally you'd put first the powder and then the liquid, on Shabbos you'd put first the liquid and then add the powder. So that's a change in the way you combine the liquid and powder. Second change is, whereas on a normal day, a weekday, you'd stir with a spoon in a circular motion, on Shabbos you do shasiva eder, you do a crisscross, one across and widthways, lengthways. Instead of stirring in a circular motion, you'd stir it in an unusual way. And so those are the shinuyim which would be necessary to use a baby cereal on Shabbos. Let's go on to the next question. Someone asked me, it's actually straightforward. Well, the question is straightforward, the question and the answer is lav davka. So here's the question. It was Rosh Chodesh Elul was Shabbos and Sunday. But this fellow was so carried away with the Rosh Chodesh Elul. So on Monday or Sunday night, he was still in the Rosh Chodesh mood. And in Shmoineh Esrei, he said Yaaleh veYovoi, which was already base Elul. So here's the question. If you said Yaaleh veYovoi, Yom Rosh Chodesh Hazeh, and it's not Rosh Chodesh, it happens to be the day before, day after, whatever, do you have to repeat the Shmoineh Esrei because you said something inappropriate, or can you ignore that mistake? So here we have a straightforward halacha in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Kuf Ches. It's straightforward here, or fairly straightforward. We'll see in other poskim it's not as straightforward. So let's read the halacha inside. Hatoye, one who makes a mistake, and maskim ma'oira. He mentions an event of other days. Sha'ar yom bitfila. Shaloi bizmano. In other words, he mentions something which doesn't really belong today. Like he said, Yaaleh veYovoi, it wasn't Rosh Chodesh, or it wasn't Chalamoyed. Or as a weekday, and he said the Shabbos davening, and so on. So then, well, if you realize, why am I saying Rosh Chodesh? It's not Rosh Chodesh, just stop short and just go on to Seitsei. But if you only realized once you've finished the brocha, or you finish Shmoineh Esrei, so there are those who say that the fact that you mentioned something which doesn't belong today, that's not called a hefsek, and you don't have to go back. You don't have to repeat. V'yesh oyimrim, there are those who say it is a hefsek, and you do have to repeat. Well, le'inyan halocha, what's the conclusion? Although generally we take the view, sofek brochas lahakel, so if you're not sure whether you are yotzer or you're not yotzer, so then you don't have to repeat. However, in tefillah, we take the view that since, as Rabbi Yochanan says in the Gemara, halavai yispal adam kol hayoyim, tefillah you can really connect to Hashem any time of the day. All right, so we have 3 set times, but you can really, the whole day is a time for davening. Therefore, here's a beautiful lashon, kol mokum shehadova muchra, where the scales are balanced. There's no more weight to one opinion to the other. It's 50-50. Then the advice is yachzor v'yispalel b'toras nedava. You should repeat the Shmoineh Esrei as a nedava, and you don't have to be mechadash dava. You don't have to add any innovations into the Shmoineh Esrei, as discussed earlier. As you can look inside, he gives you the reference. And we have a very similar psak when it comes to Aseres Yimei Tshuva. If you forgot to say Hamelech HaKadosh, and you said Hakel HaKadosh, you have to repeat the Shmoineh Esrei. If you said Hamelech Oyet Tzedakah Mishpat instead of Hamelech HaMishpat, then there is a machlokas whether you have to repeat the Shmoineh Esrei or not. And the Min Hadin you do not have to, but the advice is still Yachzor v'yispalel toras nedava. So I think it's a very similar ruling, although I didn't actually compare the wording here and the wording there word for word. Okay, so that's the answer. That if you said something which doesn't belong here today, and you said it in Shmoineh Esrei, some say it's a hefsek, some say it's not. You don't have to repeat, but it is recommended that you repeat. The halacha says it's recommended. And that's why I'm a little bit hesitant. I think there in the dinim of Hamelech HaMishpat, it might be a little bit less emphatic. Here he just gives a psak that you should repeat the Shmoineh Esrei b'toras nedava. Let's move on. Okay, here's a question. One of our listeners, Baruch Hashem, I discover new listeners from time to time, and he says he lives in Eretz Yisrael and he listens very regularly, and he tells me that he has a problem, his wife actually, that she is extremely intolerant of grain and therefore does not have bread. All right. He didn't ask about matzah, say the night. Just generally, she does not have bread. So what do you do Friday night in Shabbos for Lechem Mishneh? Well, if you don't have bread, you don't have bread. Is there, I think the way I worded the question, is there any value in being present when someone else makes the brocho over Lechem Mishneh? She's going to have fish, she's going to have salad, have cholent perhaps. She's not going to have bread. So is there any value in her dafka making a point? Well, it's not so difficult in a established family to be there, but to be yotzer Lechem Mishneh just by being present. So it took me a while to find anything about this. And eventually I found in Encyclopedia Talmudis, under Lechem Mishneh, page Tofresh, you have it in your notes, and it has there 5 different views about Lechem Mishneh. Now, there's a famous letter of the Rebbe, where someone asks, he saw in Chabad where it's common that the Balabayis will make a brocha on the Hamoitzi, and then other people are also making Hamoitzi on the piece which they receive. And the person asks from the Alter Rebbe in Siman Ayin Reid Alad Reish is the impression that you're only Yotze Lechem Mishneh if you hear the Yotze the brocha from the one who's making, the one who's breaking bread, as they say in English. And the Rebbe says that the Rebbe justifies the minhag which is done, that you are Yotze Lechem Mishneh, even though you are not Yotze the brocha. You're making your own brocha, you're still Yotze Lechem Mishneh from the Balabais. And he quotes the Bechocher Rov. I mentioned many times the Bechocher Rov was a Talmud of the Berditchever. And Bechocher Rov says even more so, that if you are even, it could be that the Balabais had made Hamoitzi, and some of the family, some of the guests, haven't even washed the Tis Yadayim. They'll wash the Tis Yadayim, then they'll come to the table, and he'll give them a slice of his Lechem Mishneh. And he says that's also okay. The essential is that the meal starts with Lechem Mishneh. But here's going even one step further, because there the Bechocher Rov is talking about people are actually going to have a piece of challah. Here we're talking about a lady who not going to have any bread at all. So is there any point of her? So here, what you have in front of you, which I found from the reference from the Encyclopedia Talmudis, a sefer called Hararei Kedem, and it's from the Rov, otherwise known as Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik. And he takes the view, now he compares it very interestingly. When you're in shul, at Shabbos by day, there's a Farbrengen, a Kiddush, and one person makes Kiddush, and everyone else, how are they Yotze Kiddush? There's a din of Kiddush on Shabbos by day. What do they have here? They don't have, some people make a point of having some of the wine. All the rest of the people who don't have a bit of the wine of Kiddush. So they didn't have the Hagofen from the one who made Kiddush, because they didn't drink any wine. So with what of their Yotze, the mitzvah of Kiddush, to say that, I was Yotze Kiddush. So the understanding is, the Kiddush HaYom is that they're setting the table, the meal should start with a brocha on a cup of wine, a Hagofen. And so long as this meal was started with Hagofen, a cup of wine, then we've had Kiddush. I'm not talking about Shabbos by night. There is the long bracha. I'm talking Shabbos by day. The dakona of Kiddush by day is that the meal should start with a bracha of a glass of wine. And then there's all right. If there's no wine, there's a whole story. What you used, Medina. We're not going to go into that. So Rabbi JB says the same thing with the Lechem Mishneh. That the din is that the meal should start with Lechem Mishneh. Whether you're eating from it, that's irrelevant. And so not if you're not eating bread at all. So there's one thing that the Sudas Shabbos, you should have bread. That's a separate thing. But this woman's not able to have bread, so you can't. But is there any point of her being present at Lechem Mishneh? So this is what, at least that the meal where she is starts with Lechem Mishneh. Yes, so there is value in that, rather than just eating it on her own without any Lechem Mishneh being done before. If someone else does Lechem Mishneh and she is partaking of the meal which started with Lechem Mishneh, so he seems to be taking the view that she is Mekayim, the Inyan of Lechem Mishneh. Let's just read a little bit of his text. The Kiyum Lechem Mishneh have a Kiyum b'fnei atzmoi b'birchas hamoitzi. Hadoim mamash lekiddush hayoim. Shedin Elias alayayin. V'hamakadosh moitzis harabi nechevos. And moitzi everyone. And they didn't taste anything of the wine. The ikar hamitzvah lekadosh alayayin. Kamoi kein harabim yoitzi dechoivas habrocha abirchas hamoitzi al lechem mishneh de'am vorech. Even if they're not actually using that brocha themselves, the fact that someone made at the beginning of this meal, made hamoitzi on Lechem Mishneh, that is covering for everyone. Very, very interesting. Which took me by surprise, and I'm happy to share it with you. Let's go on to our next question. Now, this is a Choshen Mishpat question. And so yeah, someone asked me this question, he's entitled. It's not an arbitration. It's asking me what's his side of the story. So he had some work done, and he had an air conditioner in a particular place, and the work involved, the builder's work involved moving the air conditioner. Now, air conditioners are rather new to this country. They are very, sensitive creatures. And if you move them not with tender, loving care, they sometimes decide to say goodbye. Thank you. Delicate. Thank you. So there we go. So this was the question. That after the builders had finished their work and put back the air conditioners, well, there were the two units. One of them worked, Baruch Hashem, and the other one did not work. And then now, really though, the builders know this, and they should really have called in an air conditioner specialist to move those air conditioners, those units, and they did it themselves. So there's a degree of neglect, which is, I think, admitted. And the builder says, okay, he's ready to compensate. The question is, how much? Now, I asked how old are those air conditioners, those units. So they are 10 years old, a bit more. So here's the question. You have to replace the unit. I don't think there's a big market where you can buy second-hand air conditioners in this country. So it means replacing with a brand new unit. Well, the builder could say, I damaged a 10-year-old unit. Do I have to give you replace it with a brand new unit, which is obviously much more valuable? So here we go. What I've got here in front of you is from the Sefer Pesukei Choshen, which is a contemporary encyclopedia of money matters. And he says, Tashlumei nezek heim kefi ma shehifsidoi. You pay for damages according to how much you damaged. And shovi hanezek b'shas hanezek. You're going to pay for the value of the damage at the time of the damage. So if you killed an animal, broke kalim, you'd work out how much the animal was worth at the time, how much the equipment was worth at the time, and you work out how much it was this animal was worth before you killed it, and how much it was after you killed it, and then you make the difference. That's the damage, and so you'd pay the difference. We know in Torah it says the whole story of an ox goring another ox, that the dead ox, the damaged ox, remains with its original owner, and the one who has to pay the damage, he'll pay the difference between a dead ox and a live ox, whatever that it's 80%, 90%, whatever it may be, he pays the difference. But the damaged item remains in the hands of the original owner. So here he's saying a similar thing. You damage something, the damaged item remains the property of the victim, and the perpetrator has to pay the difference between the value before and the value now. Now there's a separate discussion whether I would have to, if it's repairable, can I say, well, I'll just pay you the damage, or I have to go about repairing it? It can be, let's say, with a car. Let's say I borrowed your car and I smashed something. How much is the car now worth less? Let's say it's worth £100 less. Sometimes to repair it will cost £500. So does the perpetrator only have to pay for the loss in value of the car, or does he have to pay to repair it? So the Shach says actually that he has to pay, since it's repairable, then he has to pay for the repairs, which is much more than the loss of value. That's in that case. But here, what we're talking here is that the goods which are not repairable, that air conditioner unit is not repairable, and so how much was it worth? How much was its value last year, or whatever, before the builder got his hands on it, and how much is it? And now it's scrap, yeah. I don't know how much scrap of an air conditioner is worth, but it's scraps, and there's really nothing to talk about, not much. How much was it worth? Well, a 10-year-old air conditioner is not the same value as a new one, and therefore you'd have to repay the value of a 10-year-old air conditioner. Now, I want to share with you something which you might find very disturbing, but nevertheless, that's part of the fun, isn't it? I went away for a month, and I come back, and there's someone living in my house. Actually, you know what he did? He really felt very Hamish, and he got some paint and painted my front door a nice color. And it didn't happen. It's just having you on. He painted my house, and now I come back. Really, my house looks beautiful. But you know what? You don't belong here. It's my house. So he said, "Okay, I'm moving." I'm sorry. I thought it was, it was available. But then he says, "But wait a minute. I just spent a few £100 on decorating this house. So do I have to pay him for decorating my house?" I never invited him to do it. Well, look what you have here. So there's a field out there, and someone just went and squatted in someone else's field without permission, and he planted trees. He planted seed. So if it's a field which is, as we call it, arable land, it's dedicated to this, well, then the squatter has to be paid for what he planted. This yodia tachtoina, yodia, which means like this. Sometimes you could say, well, the materials cost £200. The increase in value is £500. So this squatter can be chutzpah, can say, wait a minute, your field is now worth £500 more. Say, no, that not. Yoda la tachtoina. I'll pay you your expenses. Or it can be the other way around. I spent £500 on fixing up this field, but it's only £200 increase in value. Okay, so I'll pay you the increase in value. I'm not going to pay you for your costs. That's what it means, yoda la tachtoina. I'm going to pay you the lesser of the increase in value or the costs. But he does have to get paid. And this is, you find this, I'm sure some of you are going to find this very, very surprising. So someone took my property and put something in of value. So in the second sifa, he planted trees. So the owner can say, take your trees, get into hay. So then he can do that. And then we have here, all right, so there's lots of detail here, but the principle is, and this is why I'm sharing this. The principle is that someone was wrong. They should not have come here, and they shouldn't have touched my property. Yet, I'm not justified in becoming richer because of them. They have to, if they damage, they have to compensate me for the damage. But it would be wrong for me to turn around and say, wow, look, someone squatted my property, and now I've got a brand new kitchen, which is installed. I didn't ask them to do it. Now I've got a brand new kitchen, which is worth £15,000. And I kicked him out, which I was justified in doing that. But the brand new kitchen, actually, you can't walk away with that brand. No, obviously not going to walk away. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to keep it because I didn't ask you to do it. You are obliged to pay for the increased value. So coming back to this air conditioner, now you understand where I'm coming from. That the builder damaged your air conditioner, he has to pay you the value. But to say that now I've got a much more valuable piece of equipment, the builder could turn around and say, listen, I damaged a cheap piece of equipment. Now you've got an expensive piece of equipment, pay me the difference. So yeah, let's go on to our last question. And although it's fairly straightforward, but let's discuss it. So last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a discussion about very wide gates, to the point that they're so wide that when they're open, it's more than 10 amos, and we discussed whether the Rishus HaYochid loses its status of Rishus HaYochid at the time the gates are open. So since we are already on this field of Eruv, so someone asks me the question, if a perimeter wall of a property is made up of Tzuras HaPesach, which means poles and wires across, but each of those poles is less than 10 amos apart, is that enough for to enclose the entire property to make it a Rishus HaYochid? So here we have, this is from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Samach Beis, if you test, if you did a Tzuras HaPesach, even if it's more than 10 amos, that works for the entire perimeter. Now, that's the first view. The second view is, I'm making this quick, V'yesh oimrim, that Tzuras HaPesach does not work for a gap of more than 10 amos. Now, this is people talking about the city Eruvin, which many of them rely on poles and wires, which may be, if it's the majority of the perimeter. So according to, and these city Eruvin, the distance between the wires, between the poles, is typically well over 10 amos. So is a Eruv, or what we call the Eruv, with more than 10 amos apart, is that valid if that's the majority of the perimeter? So the first one says yes. The second view says no. But, and this is important to our answer, if the gap between the poles is 10 or less, so then Tzuras HaPesach does work. Va'afilu kol haruchos hein al yedei Tzuras HaPesach, even if you've got the entire perimeter is surrounded with poles and wires across in the correct way, even if it's so long as there's ve'ein bohen eser al eser, in other words, if the gap between the poles is less than 10 amos, then that would be a valid mechitza. It would be considered like a wall around, and you'd be able to carry it without any hesitation. So that's the answer to that question. With that, I'm going to finish a couple of minutes early and wish you a good night and a good Shabbos and a ksiva v'chasima tova. Kol tov.
Good Shabbos.
Kol tov. Thank you.
Good Shabbos.